So as you all know, we're doing this series on Jesus is greater than, and we are at this epic chapter in the Bible looking at some of the heroes of faith. And I had requested you all to see who your favorite sports person is. You know, one person whom I really liked and really admire is Usain Bolt. You know, we all know that yesterday was the last race that he ran of his career. And of course, it didn't super well for him, but still, he was someone, I like him for two things. It's not just the speed. Of course, he's fast. He's the fastest man on earth. But he was able to pull that off for a long time. 3 consecutive gold medals in the Olympics, that's not easy. You know, that talks of some endurance. Being able to perform at that level over a decade needs endurance. So he demonstrates that. The other thing I really like about him is how he's so cool amidst intense pressure. If you've watched any of his pre-race antics, he's joking around, he's goofing around. You know, there's like 50 to 100,000 people watching you. It's the greatest stage. I don't know if how many of you are comfortable standing before a crowd of 50 people. You know, most people have stage fear. But this guy can stand in the stage and just have fun and not be intimidated. He has no fear whatsoever. You know, so those two things are something I really admire about him, and they say he's probably one of the greatest legends, like Muhammad Ali and Pele, and that's how he wants to be. And it's always inspiring to see someone like that in the real life, isn't it? And that's why people follow him. He has like so many followers who admire not just his speed, because we all know we can never run as fast as Usain Bolt, but we admire some of these characteristics. And I'm sure you have yours and you were able to share that with each other. But today we're looking into the life of one of the greatest heroes in the Bible, and his name is Moses. You know, Moses was no ordinary man. If you read about him, what is a commentary that God gives about Moses? You can turn your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 10 to 12, and this is what the Bible says who Moses was. Verse 10, it says, "And there has not risen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Wow, imagine that. "None like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of Israel." He's the greatest. You know, the greatest of all time. As they say, the GOAT, right? Everyone wants to be the GOAT in their area. And here was Moses, greatest in his league, greatest prophet the Israelites had ever seen. And he is portrayed to us today for two things. As you read his story that it's talked about, you hear two words popping out in the life of Moses that he lived through faith to encourage us. And those two things was how he overcame fear and how he endured suffering. How by faith Moses overcame fear, and how by faith Moses endured. You know, the two things that all of us have and seek are fear and endurance. We all have our fears. If we ask each one of us, what is your biggest fear today? I'm not asking about your fear of spiders or cockroaches and all that stuff, right? I'm sure people are terrified about that, absolutely, but that's not the fear we are talking about. What are some of the deepest fears that you have today? You know, perhaps for some, it may be the fear of losing a job and not knowing how things will happen after that. Or if you're younger and you're in the process of getting married, your fear is finding that perfect guy or the perfect girl whom you are so desperate to find and are not able to find, and you're afraid, what if I never find this person? And the reality is, a lot of young adults in the Bay Area do not get married for a long time because they're waiting to find that perfect spouse. Or if you're even younger, your fear is probably of not getting into the best school. You know, what happens if I don't make it? Or If you're a parent, your fear is, what if my child gets lost in the culture or makes wrong decisions or makes wrong choices? Or if you're a little older, your fear could be about a health condition that you have or you're afraid of. We all have fears. I'm sure there is no one in this room who can honestly say, I don't have fear. And it's not just the fears, we also each have our own crisis that we are dealing with. We may all look smiling and happy and walking around and living healthy lives, but if we ask each one honestly, are you battling a crisis in your life today? Everyone has a story. Trust me, everyone has a story. It could be a crisis that's caused by a job because you think you're stuck in a job you hate or a boss you hate. It could be a health crisis for some, or it could be a relationship crisis with spouse or friends or children, or wanting to be identified and accepted and not getting that. We all have a crisis. And everyone's crisis is big, equally big. So how do we deal with our fears on the one hand that we have and we wrestle with every day, while at the same time stand strong through the crisis? Where do we go to look for hope? And so here in this passage we read, God presents to us Moses, who by faith overcomes his fear and by faith endures all the crisis life throws at him. And we are going to dig into it and glean some lessons that we could probably apply to our lives. Now first, it says that by faith in verse 24, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, by choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Moses is now displaying a remarkable characteristic of not being intimidated and afraid by his current life situation. Where do you think Moses gets this from? Where does Moses get this fear of overcoming whatever is the biggest challenge to him? Well, if we read in the preceding verse, in verse 23, it says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. He gets it from his parents. His mom, who's actually a granddaughter of Levi himself. And she lived at a time when the Pharaoh passed this edict of slaughtering all male children, and goes even a step further to say, if any male child is found, I want you to toss them into the Nile for crocodiles to devour them. And here it says their parents were not intimidated by that. It says, by faith, they hid him for 3 months because they saw that the child was beautiful. Now, if you think, they kept the child because the child was cured, all children are beautiful when they are born. He's not talking of just physical beauty there, but if you dig deeper, and commentators tell us, they saw that there was a destiny that God had for this child that had been revealed to them. That they had a faith that this is no ordinary child. This is a child through whom redemption is going to come for us and the entire Israel. And therefore they believed in God, and by faith were not intimidated against the greatest king who ever lived around at that time and who was persecuting them. As parents, the precious thing we can pass on to our children is not our money, is not education, but our faith. And they will remember that. They will remember that. If Jesus is really greater than everything for us, he will be greater than everything for our children too. If we say Jesus is greater than everything for us, and live lives like money is greater than everything, or success is greater than everything, then that is exactly what they'll get, if not for the surprising grace of God. And Moses gets that from his parents. Why do we fear? If you think about it, what causes fear? Psychologists actually study this very deeply. and trying to identify why are we afraid of something and why are we not afraid of certain things. And they found a very interesting correlation of why we actually experience fear. They come to a consensus in saying fear is tied to losing something we hold dear or of central value to us. Let me repeat, and listen carefully to this. Fear is tied to losing something we hold dear or is of central value to us. That's what psychologists have figured out. All of us have several things we love, right? As we grow up, as we become adults and we live in this country. We love our jobs, we love our children, we love our hobbies, good stuff, not bad stuff. And there's always a competition between the different things we love. At sometimes, some things become more important, at other times, other things become more important. But we are always constantly valuing what we love and what is really important for us, and we place them in a hierarchy. We may say, for example, hey, I love my work when you first get your first job. And you're excited, wow, I studied hard, I worked hard, I got my first job. And then after a few years, you're kind of disgruntled and, it's the same thing you're doing again, and you're married and your kids, and now you're just working because you can put the food on the table, but what you now actually really love are your kids. You come home and it's such a fun time to hang out with them. But this is what happens. Psychologists say when what we love or hold dear goes through a threat of being taken away is when we begin to experience anxiety and fear. When what we love or hold dear goes through a threat of being taken away is when we begin to experience anxiety and fear. Moses had a choice. He grew in a palace, and he could inherit everything that a pharaoh would have by just sticking to the palace. But he also grew with his mom, who instructed him in his faith and told him about the grand plan of God from Adam to Abraham. And so he's at a dilemma. What is going to be of central value to him? So if he chooses to stay in the palace, he is going to be alienated from his own people. If he chooses to stand with his people, he's going to face the wrath of the Pharaoh. And so here is Moses. He can choose the identity of being a Pharaoh's grandson or being a redeemer for Israel. So he goes out. We all know the story. He sees this guard beating up one of his fellow Israelites, and he tries to stop him, and he hits him, and he dies, and he buries him. Now this is all cool. All he has to do is go to the Pharaoh and say, hey, I messed up. I kind of had a fit of rage. I killed a guy. He's just a common soldier. Pharaoh's going to say, no worry, Moses. Don't worry about it. You're after all the Pharaoh. You can do whatever you want. But then the next day he goes to the Israelites, and he talks to them and engages in a conversation, and two of them are fighting, and he says, why are you fighting, guys? We should be united. And he says, why are you talking about? I just saw you killing another guy. Moses so far thought no one knew what he did because he looked around to see there was no one when he did that. But now he saw that, someone actually saw it, and Pharaoh's going to know pretty soon. And guess what? This is what hurt him the most. The people for whom he was fighting for, they themselves rejected him. So if he goes to the Pharaoh is going to go after him when he knows that he fought for the Israelites if he claims that identity. But the same people for whom he was fighting for also were saying no. And so Moses has a decision to make. He's trying to decide what's important for him. But he chooses still to identify with his brothers, the Israelites, and their suffering, even though they mistreat him. And that's what it says. By faith, Moses refused to be called the sons of Pharaoh, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God. He chose. The first thing Moses did, the action verb is he chose. He chose to do something which was to put his value on what will please and give him joy, not just for a short time, but for eternity. How do we overcome fear? It is when we recognize that all the things that we tend to put our value on will provide only pleasure for a short time, isn't it? We all know that. We all know money is temporary. Money only lasts. Money can give us pleasure only while it lasts. It's only when you have money you're going to enjoy life, right? And there is no guarantee that you're going to have money all through your life. Silicon Valley is one of the most interesting place where disruption happens significantly. If you look at it historically, what has happened in the Silicon Valley, of course we had the native Indians, and then there was the famous gold rush, right? That's from which comes the 49ers. People were drawn to this place for the gold rush, and some made big bucks. And then they started big railroads and MGM and Hollywood studios and all of that stuff. And then that dried up. And once gold dried up, a lot of people lost a lot of money. And then people came in for the agricultural boom that was happening because this land was so fertile and people made big money through farming and agriculture. And then after some time, when the Industrial Revolution took over, food was no longer a great commodity. It was reduced for its value. So even if you were farming, you weren't making a lot of money. And then came the next disruption, which was the discovery of the silicon chip. And chips and Silicon Valley was created. The same valley is now made money through technology, and that's what drew people. And that now has shifted to digital world, and we are creating a digital world right here. The Internet of everything is going on, and we are reaping that. But who knows when the next disruption might happen? And we all saw what happened to Detroit with the car industry. No one thought about it. In a flip of a switch, homes that were valued millions of dollars were deserted, literally. And no one was even wanting to buy that. So money can give us that pleasure only while it lasts, but if you're going to put all our value on it, and we are afraid if that's taken away, then that's going to create anxiety. But no. And it's the same with power. You can enjoy power while you are in office. You can think like, oh, I have so many people working under me. I feel so valuable, or I'm contributing this way to this project. I am the only guy who have these skill sets to do this. But the moment you change roles or you change a company, you can see what happens to your power. So Moses chose something very wisely. He looked at the fleeting pleasures that a life in the Pharaoh's household could cause, and he looked at something that will give him pleasure forever. He knew that only God and his purposes and his plans are worth living for, because he had stories after stories after stories from his mom and dad about what God did to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, who was the last prince of Egypt. And so Moses was able to turn away from all the fleeting pleasures of these things, that they no longer have control over him, and was able to look at God. He decides to put his faith on this God and what he can do. And so he overcame fear. So he was not intimidated by Pharaoh, because he was looking at someone who even controls the Pharaoh. One of a few people I really admire and cherish were our friends when we were ministering in Germany, Heiko and Marenka. These are people who are very dear to us. Some of you know my story. When I got really sick, they were 2 of the 3, 4 friends who prayed with us dearly, and God answered their prayers and healed me and all of that. But Heiko is an eye surgeon. He's one of the most humblest people I've ever met. And he's a brilliant guy. He does a lot of stuff. but he had a heart to use his skill to make a difference in the world. So after they were married, Heiko and Marinka moved to Africa, and they chose a village near Tanzania. It's a tiny village, doesn't even have electricity, water, any of those modern amenities. And it was a village where over 60% of the people have lost eyesight because of vitamin A deficiency. And he decided he is going to restore eyesight to these people, one person at a time, surgically. And he has been doing that not for 1 day, 10 days, 1 month, for the past 10 years, and still lives there near Mount Kilimanjaro. And I really want to go and see him. He's one of my heroes. And I look at him like, Heiko, man, you can make millions of money in Germany. You're an eye surgeon, man. Or you can come to the United States and be even more famous and successful. But here is a guy who, very quietly, without saying a word, without making great noise, decides to go and make a difference in a place where it's needed the most. They are not outliers. God wants us to not be intimidated by anything in this world, to not hold ourselves down by our jobs, by our money, by anything else, but to look at Him. Look what He has done throughout history. Look what He has done with our own lives, and see that He is weaving this beautiful tapestry which we don't see now, so that we will not have fear for our boss. We will not have fear for losing money. We will not have fear for our future. And all fear is gone when we look at Him and trust Him. And that's why we sing this song, because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future, and life is worth the living just because He lives. Amen? I love this song. Moses chose God and His plans, and not the world and what the world says is smart. Faith overcomes fear by choosing God over everything. Faith overcomes fear by choosing God over everything. Secondly, faith sustains us through our suffering. You know, it's easy to obey God when He tells you things that are pretty straightforward. Hey, go here, do this, go here, do that. But when God tells you to do something and you know that's not an easy path and you're going to embrace suffering, obeying God becomes very hard, isn't it? When we know, for example, if we do the right thing, it may bring up pain or suffering, it becomes really hard for us to do. For Moses, he knew that if he were to leave his palace, and he's already rejected by his people, he's going to live a life of suffering, and he did for the next 40 years of his life. Moses was living a low-profile life in some remote place in a desert, doing nothing. And it didn't just stop there. Then God shows up to him and He says, hey Moses, I want you to now go back to Pharaoh, the guy who's waiting to kill you, and I want to ask him to leave all the people who have been working for him, the millions of Jews, to come with you. How cool is that? And it doesn't just stop there, and even after he does this through all those miracles, the same people who come with him are going to give him a hard time for the next 40 years of his life. For Moses, obeying God's call meant a life of suffering. If God were to tell you, hey Bob, hey John, I want you to follow this path. And you know what? It's just going to be filled with suffering all throughout. Are you okay for this? How many of us would sign up for something like that? But God had to walk Moses through suffering. You know why? It's not just Moses. It's for all of us. And he says, and when he did, Moses did what Moses did. He said he considered something, he processed something, and thought, what's valuable? It says, verse 26, he considered rather to be mistreated with the people of God. He considered the reproach of Christ greater than the wealth, the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. You know, Moses was not ready to lead when God called him first. God had to first break him before he could use him. Why would anyone choose suffering? Why would anyone obey God when he walks us through a period of suffering? None of us would say, I want to suffer, God, give me more suffering, give me more suffering. But when God walks you through a period of suffering, it's better to obey God in suffering and through suffering, though we don't see what the end result will be, by trusting that He's doing something beautiful. And God always does something beautiful through pain and suffering most of the time in our lives. When we go through suffering, we are focused on what we do. But God is focused on who we are and what we are becoming as a result of what we do. He does all those deep heart surgeries. Moses had to be humbled. He had it all. He had the right training. He went to the Harvard, the MIT, the Stanfords, put them all together. He was the most handsome guy. He had everything, except his heart was not broken yet. And it needed 40 years in the desert to be broken. And you and me are no different than Moses. We may want to do great things for God. We may want to live and do awesome things for the world. But God's not interested in what cool things you can do for Him, as though we are trying to help God. God is interested in seeing how your heart is. God is interested in seeing if your heart reflects the heart of Christ. And you cannot reflect the heart of Christ unless you are willing to suffer like Christ did. Because it is through suffering Christ is formed in us. I might get into trouble for saying this, so don't misquote me. Christ is not formed when you listen to a sermon. Christ is not formed when you are going to a Bible study. Christ is not formed when you are doing church stuff. Christ is formed through pain and suffering. I'm not saying don't do all those things, and not showing up next week is not the reason. Oh, Pastor said, Christ is not formed. These are supposed to help that, but the real deal happens in the grind, in the grit of the daily grind of pain and suffering when we go through that. Whatever pain you are going through now, God is working at breaking you now. So He can use you later. It's just better to obey God and go through the suffering. Faith sustains us through suffering, knowing that it will make us look more like Jesus. Faith sustains us through suffering, knowing that it will make us look more like Jesus. And thirdly, verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Moses by faith considered, by faith chose, and by faith endured. The word endurance is a very interesting Greek word. It means hupostasos, which it comes, if you translate it, it means hupo is hyper and stasos is standing. Hyper standing, which means you're standing strong like a rock, even when the whole earth is moving around you. That's the word endurance is. You're so strong that nothing can move you, nothing can shake you. And that's what it says Moses did. Through all the storms, through all the trials, through all the pain, through all the suffering, through all the rejection of the very own people he was trying to help with. Remember the words they tell him? When he takes them out after all these dramatic plagues and all of that stuff, and they're about to cross the Red Sea, they look at him and say, "Did you bring us here so we can be drowned in the sea?" How fun do you think is it to lead a people like that? I'm sure some of you guys have been managers and directors and you have teams of people working for you. How cool is it when your folk come and tell you that you're stupid? They're basically telling Moses, you're stupid. You're an idiot, Moses. And then they did not do it once, he did it multiple times. In the desert, they do the same thing. Oh, we had great food in Egypt, and why did you bring us here to eat this junk food? Which was not junk, it was heavenly food. And so, for him to endure that, there must be something more. How do you guys endure all the crises that you go through in life? You know, endurance doesn't come automatically. It's not like the flip of a switch that you can suddenly now endure everything. They're all interconnected. Not putting our faith in what does not matter and freeing us from our fear helps with endurance. Embracing pain and suffering, looking at the reward we will get, helps with endurance. But the greatest of these is here. It says, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. He endured to see the invisible Christ than be happy seeing the visible King. Jesus was really greater than everything for Moses, and his desire was to see him and know him, and so he endured. How many of you know Joni Eareckson Tada? Now you've heard who she is, probably not many. For those of you who don't know who she is, Joni Eareckson Tada has, when she was 17 years old, she had a sport injury that completely paralyzed her, everything from neck down. She was such an active, vibrant young girl, very adventurous, loved sports, loved adventure sports, but this one injury just left her a quadriplegic from her neck down. And she went through pain. Imagine for a person like that to say, you're going to spend the rest of your life without being able to move anything below your neck. She mentions in her article that she was so depressed. She hated thinking, how am I going to live my life without moving my hands and my feet? She would run her wheelchair multiple times into the wall, trying to break the chair and hurt herself. She would try to immerse her grief with alcohol and wine and all the wrong things the world could offer because she was so angry and so disappointed. But then she says she found a group of friends who shared in her suffering, who came alongside her, and who poured out love upon her, and helped her to find Jesus, and helped her to find hope in Jesus. And then she starts writing and thinking and reading and understanding who God is. She said then she spent the several months of her life trying to understand who is God. She would read great works by wonderful people like J.I. Packer and Martin Lloyd-Jones and the Reformers, and understanding where was God when this happened to me. She wanted to know the sovereignty of God. Why did God allow this to happen? And through all of that, God changed her. And she spent the next 50 years of her life in that wheelchair, doing nothing but ministering to people just like her. There's a recent article she wrote in the Gospel Coalition where she said she was writing a letter to a 17-year-old teenager now who had a diving accident and became a quadriplegic like her. And she says, I know exactly how Tony's going to feel. I know all the difficulties he's going to have to cross. Oh, I know how hard it is going to be for him. And she writes letters to these people and was celebrating this 50th anniversary with people whose lives had been transformed hearing her story. And they came and told her, one person who had another crisis and had lost everything, Joni Eareckson Tada, thank God for that accident in your life, if not for which we all have no hope. She brought hope into the lives of so many people. And you know what Joni Eareckson Tada says, reflecting back on her 50 years of life? She says, I really would rather be in this wheelchair knowing Jesus as I do than be on my feet without him. I really would rather be in this wheelchair knowing Jesus as I do than be on my feet without him. She's not a great theologian. She's a very ordinary person. And she's not giving some emotional, inspirational speech. She has lived it out for 50 years consistently, demonstrating to you and to me that faith in Christ enables endurance when we choose to see this Jesus. You know, faith enables you and me to endure by looking at a better Moses. You know, we see someone in Moses. We know of someone who left a much greater place than the Pharaohs. We know of someone who came to his own, who came to you and me, and we never received him. We know of someone who was rejected by all of us in a far deeper way, and he was rejected by God the Father himself on the cross, when all of us and our own shortnesses killed him. But we see how God used the very same rejection to bring salvation to those of us. We see that God can redeem even the worst of us when we go through difficult times. And we see this Jesus who was willing to be rejected, and yet he was obedient to God, so that you and me, even when we go through trials, we can be obedient to God. Obeying God meant that he was going to go through hell, and yet God's gracious redemption came out of it. So when we face problems in life, we have in front of us, what do we need to do is to look at this Jesus who obeyed pain and suffering on the cross, who was far better than Moses, and he is right now with you and with me to help us stand strong even through the worst crisis that we may go through in our lives. Faith overcomes fear by choosing what will not impact us. Faith enables endurance by helping us fix our eyes upon Jesus and obeying him, and that will lead us out. What are you afraid of this morning? What is it that's controlling you, that's making you anxious? What are the trials you're facing and you feel you can't stand and you might fall? If we can make this Jesus to be greater than everything, rather than the things of this world, if we can make this Jesus our heart's desire and see what he left for our sake and how he obeyed, and if that inspires us for the reward that we have in God, then you and me, by the same faith, can overcome fear and endure. May God enable us to do that. Let's pray.